In the final video of this week, let's look at the way autocratic governments present themselves as Western and an increasingly Islamist opposition forms in their country. Remember, in the Cold War context, we now have a desire by both states to keep their allies stable, to stabilize. There's a general interest in maintaining and stabilizing the status quo. And the autocratic rulers that have now sprang up in most of the developing world, and also among some of the satellite countries, they're primarily afraid of a secular opposition developing inside. So both left-leaning and right-leaning governments belonging to both camps rely on oppression to stabilize their reign. And social institutions and channel for the political expression of conflicting interests, they are not created or they remain underdeveloped. And that's an important thing to remember. Just as a side, in the last video we discussed the creation of the United Arab Republic, the unification of Egypt and Syria. That remained a purely rhetorical device. It was just a very thin party now of combining existing institutions. But they did not create an institutional basis on which that unification of these two countries could actually persist. And compare this, I mean, we don't have time to do this in this course, but maybe in your own research, try to compare this to the creation of the European Union, for example, which was also an elite-driven project, but it spent a lot of time, effort, personal capacity on creating the institutions, the courts, the parliaments, the commission, on which that unification and political integration functioned. Here, the United Arab Republic is simply declared to exist, and 3 years later, Syria leaves that union. It declares it to no longer exist. There's no institutions are created in the meantime. So that is one of the key characteristics I'd like you to pay attention to. So there's an extremely shallow political culture existing in these countries. They rely on charismatic leadership, particularly in Egypt, but also elsewhere, as a shortcut to the creation and the painful and costly creation of institutions. And we see during this period a ruthless extermination or suppression of any form of political opposition. And that is something that we see across the countries, and that ultimately paves the way for the ascendancy of Islamist opposition, because almost by default they remain the last man standing, because the mosques remain almost the only institution that remains free or relatively free of government interference, whereas all secular opposition had been now suppressed. In the Egyptian context, remember, now Nasser is this charismatic leader. He's beloved by his people. They call him back even after the disastrous defeat of 1967. But then in 1970 he dies. And here we see his funeral procession. And I mentioned already that any charismatic authority has the problem of succession. So how does Egypt address this problem? The way you would, how do you think this functional problem of succession to this larger than life figure Nasser is solved? Do you think Egypt has another charismatic leader in the wings waiting to fill these shoes? No, exactly, they don't. And the way they address the solution is, as you would imagine, they pick a compromise candidate. Anwar Sadat is one of the only two surviving members of the three officers that had initially putsched. He is a relatively uncharismatic, a relatively boring man. He is seen as a compromised temporary candidate until they can find someone else, someone better, someone more charismatic. He's the least threatening of the potential candidates. So he's seen as a temporary figurehead. And now this man, who does not have the natural charisma that Nasser possessed, has to solve the functional problem of establishing authority without charisma. So he cannot rely on traditional authority, and he does not have the resources to build a bureaucratic, rational, legal authority. So he has a problem with legitimacy, and that is something that we see also in other countries, particularly when we talk about Pakistan later on. You will see a similar approach to this functional problem. But that is, remember, that functional problem of how to bolster his legitimacy in the absence of charisma, which, if you remember, had been a shortcut to institutions that don't exist. This perhaps negative picture of Sadat that might now develop in your minds needs to be contrasted with him as a statesman. He actually, unlike Nasser, had a very clear strategic vision for Egypt. He realizes that Nasser's adventurism had not served Egypt well. And he sees that the disastrous two last wars had inflicted a heavy cost on the Egyptian state, economy, and society. And that particularly after the last war, which led to this very significant loss of territory, he wanted two things now, and he creates a strategy to achieve these two things. He wants his land back, and he wants to shift Egypt out of the Soviet sphere of influence and into the American sphere of influence. And he realizes that to do so will necessitate breaking with a number of now established Nasserist principles. Let's briefly recall the outcome of the 1967 war was absolutely disastrous for Egypt. If you look at the map, they lost very considerable territory in the Sinai. The entire Sinai is lost to Israel. But also, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are lost from Palestine or Jordan, depending on your point of view. And the Golan Heights are now held by Israel. These very considerable territorial gains by Israel are now on the forefront of Sadat's thinking. And he wants to repossess, particularly the Sinai. That is his primary interest. And he knows that in order to achieve this strategic aim, he will have to break ranks with the Arab position until now. You see here, we have a picture here from the 1964 Arab League summit meeting. The Arab League, ever since 1948, and they had reconfirmed that position in 1968, had been very clear that there would be no separate negotiations with Israel. They would maintain a unified rank and achieve the commonly formulated position that they had. Sadat is now willing to break ranks with that position, and he knows full well what the implications of that positions are. It will mean the ostracism of Egypt within the Arab camp, and domestically it also means a repudiation of the Nasserist claim to pan-Arab leadership. So in pursuit of this policy, he pressures his Soviet backers to replenish the arsenal, the Egyptian arsenal. Here we see a destroyed T-62 Soviet tank. So the Soviets replenish the Egyptian arsenal once again in preparation of a war that has a very clear but limited strategic objective. Sadat does not want to defeat Israel, and he knows that he's not going to be able to retake the territories by force alone. What he wants to do is to instill on Israel and the American backers that Egypt is a military force to be reckoned with, and that breaking Egypt out of the unified Arab camp is worth paying a very heavy price, because he knows that for Israel to return the lands it had gained, even if it's only the Egyptian lands, is a very, very heavy material and psychological cost. So for this, he knows that in the war that he's preparing for, he has to put up a better show than the Egyptian army had been able to do in 1967. politically, the war achieves exactly its purpose. It does instill on Israel and the American backers that Egypt and the Egyptian military force needs to be reckoned with. And the relative coherent performance of the Egyptian army did surprise the Israelis and their American backers. So in many respects, this was a war to negotiate, not a war to win. And negotiations begin shortly after, well, relatively shortly afterwards. And here we see an image of the Camp David negotiations in '78 mediated by the American President Carter, between Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. And they lead to the conclusion of the Camp David Accords, in which Egypt becomes the first Arab nation to regain lost territory in return for the recognition of Israel and the creation of diplomatic relations with Israel. And you know that Sadat and Begin both received the Nobel Prize for this, and they've been very much celebrated for this decision in the West. Here we see in this picture Sadat and Begin in a joint session of the American Congress. And you see similar receptions throughout the West. But this positive image of Sadat as a peacemaking leader of the Arab world is not at all replicated in the Arab world. There he's seen as a traitor. And it needs to be acknowledged that that's basically what he did. He broke with an established Arab position. And he left the joint Arab ranks. And there's a gravely negative impact on his personal reputation and on the situation of Egypt throughout the Arab world as a result of this. This negative impact now needs to be seen in the context of the already relatively weak legitimacy that he enjoyed when he assumed power. So, and he knew that this would be the result of the policies he chose. So let's go back to the 1970 when he assumed power and try to picture yourself in Sadat's shoes, who is now this relatively uncharismatic leader who wants to pursue a policy that he considers to be necessary and correct, but that he also knew is going to be highly unpopular domestically. And I cannot stress enough how unpopular that decision was on the Arab street. What do you think is going to be the domestic approach Sadat takes to bolster his legitimacy? Nasser, enjoyed natural charisma and had played a very openly secular left-leaning policy. Sadat does not enjoy that natural charisma. So what he does, and he realizes that his primary opponents domestically are no longer the communists or other secular groups, is the Islamists, the politically organized Islamically oriented groups, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. And what he does is he opens the political space in Egypt to an extent not known under Nasser, in an effort to meet them halfway, to take some of the basis for the political opposition that existed away from the Muslim Brotherhood and the other Islamic groups. And he tries to appease them also on other fronts. Here we see a picture of Sayyid Qutb, one of the leading intellectual figures of the Muslim Brotherhood. So he tries to meet them also ideologically to some extent. And again, this is a policy that we see replicated, particularly in Pakistan, where we talk about it under Zia-ul Haq. And it's important for you to realize that here we have a relatively weak government that responds to Islamic opposition no longer merely by repression, but also by trying to appease them. And one of the ways they do this is that Sadat now changes the Egyptian constitution. And here we see a tightening of the constitutional text The Article 2 that I just framed you before is now rephrased, and Sharia is elevated from a principal source of legislation to the principal source of legislation. So there is an explicit shift from the secular orientation that existed until then, and Islamic law is now given a prominent role in the constitutional setup of the state. One of the key demands of the Islamists. And so try to see the political context in which this change takes place. So it's a relatively weak government pursuing a highly unpopular external policy and trying to neutralize domestic opposition by appeasing and meeting some of their key demands. So, and this is something we will see in other countries replicated. So with this constitutional change comes also a greater role being given to Al-Azhar, the main Islamic university in Egypt and actually throughout the Islamic world. And Al-Azhar now starts to look into the codification of certain key areas of Islamic law in order to give practical effect to this change. And the aim is to bolster the legitimacy of a government that they can no longer rely on charismatic authority. So there are two general lessons to draw from this, and these are things that we see also in other countries, that the suppression of organized civil and political opposition movements leaves the mosque as the only viable channel for opposition. This is something we saw in we will see when we talk about Iran as well. So it's almost the Islamist opposition as the last man standing. And the second point is, as I said, the attempts by relatively weak governments to bolster the legitimacy through an appeal to Islamic norms. And that's inherently a problem, because once the government tries to appeal to the norms taken by Islamist movements, the population generally prefers the original to the copycat. And that's a problem we see in Pakistan later on, where also this state-led Islamization process ultimately backfires and leads to a dramatic radicalization of the population. So how did this policy play out for Sadat himself? And you probably, those of you who have a firm grasp of the history, you probably know what happened. Sadat is assassinated after Egypt has regained its territory. So the policy is ultimately very successful for Egypt as a nation, but it has now broken ranks with the common Arab position. It has betrayed the Arab cause. It has betrayed the Palestinian people in the perception of its Islamist opposition. And Sadat is now assassinated by one of his own officers, Khaled Eslambouli, at a military parade. And Eslambouli becomes now one of the martyrs of the Islamist movements. The Iranian government issues a stamp in his honor, names a big street in his honor. We have today Al-Qaeda terrorist groups that are named in honor of Eslambouli. You have Chechen fighters who name the groups after Eslambouli. So he becomes now a key martyr. Eslambouli is obviously apprehended right after the assassination and later executed. But while his act is clearly extreme, it represents a general rejection of Egypt and the path Egypt has chosen. Egypt is expelled from the Arab League for 10 and only readmitted 10 years later. It's suspended from the organization of the Islamic Conference and only readmitted in 1984. And again, now the assassination leaves the Egyptian state with the question of succession, and a similar decision is taken. We have Hosni Mubarak, who is now also comes from the army, is now chosen to succeed Sadat. He's similarly short of charisma, similarly short of personal achievements, and pursues a relatively similar policy of trying to bolster his legitimacy by continuing a policy of repression, but at the same time trying to appease his primary opponents, which are the Muslim opposition. So we see in Egypt now, and that's something that we see elsewhere as well, a dual policy of suppression, of the constriction of political space, but at the same time trying to meet some of the key demands of the Islamist opposition. And note another common feature that is becoming now very clearly discernible in Egypt. And that's something common throughout the Muslim world and actually throughout the developing world. That in the absence of stable social and political institutions, the army becomes almost the only pillar of stability. And it becomes the default source of political and institutional support for the government. And this is reflected in the benefits being lavished on the army. As I mentioned before, Egypt becomes now the primary recipient of American civil and military aid, and the army is a primary recipient, obviously, of the military aid, but also heavily benefits heavily from the economic policies that are then taken. And so the army becomes one of the, if not the most important economic actor in the Egyptian state, running its own factories, its own agricultural lands, its own transportation networks. And that's something we see also in other countries, particularly in Pakistan, when we talk about that later on. And that raises a common problem throughout the developing world, which is called in political science the Praetorian problem, basically. How do you control the military institution that is generally tasked with protecting the state and society from external enemies, and that now starts to prey on its domestic population? And in a sense, now it's sort of leading over to the contemporary problems, that is one of the key factors fueling the contemporary conflict in Egypt, where the army as an institution tries to protect its own institutional interests and the interests of its members from claim by other civil actors in the that might compete for these resources. Apart from the Praetorian problem that is common in the developing world, another commonality, particularly in the Arab world, is the strong support by thinly disguised military regimes, by Western powers that accept the claim by these regimes to be the vanguard of modernism, Western values, secularism, Western law, against who are standing against an atavistic Islamic onslaught, and therefore asking for certain leeway in the way they deal with domestic opposition. Here we see a collection of various wives of local despots in the Arab world, and all of them are beautiful, Western dressed, and they obviously appeal to a Western audience, reflected not in the very heavy coverage that these ladies receive in the yellow press in the West. But we need to be aware that this image of Western values that these regimes present to the West, and that the Western nations have for a long time readily accepted, and particularly the image that they present of a dualism between them as the defenders of universal secular values facing an Islamist onslaught is not necessarily accurate. And it's a false dichotomy, and that's what I'd like you to draw attention to, and that's the last point of this video. This false dichotomy between secularism in the form of autocracies and an Islamist onslaught is, in my view, not accurate, because if you look at the demands being expressed in the current upheavals, but they've been expressed for a long time, it's not so much a debate between secularism and an Islamic state. It's more a demand for social justice and proper administration and the delivery of services. So it's a struggle, and it's a demand for better state services, a better functioning state, and a less kleptocratic state. So it's not at all a question between secularism and theocracy. And it's the ready acceptance by particularly Western nations of the claims put forward by autocratic regimes in the last 20 to 40 years has led to a dramatic delegitimization of the Western model. And that's something that needs to be kept in mind when we now talk about the Western ability to influence current events in these countries. Not in Egypt, but throughout the countries that are now experience upheavals, is the need for particularly Western nations to reassess their own self-image and how that self-image is perceived, how their image is perceived in the target countries. And it's not at all the same image. For that association with the repression of the last decades is not easily forgotten. This concludes our coverage of North Africa for this week, and I invite you to come back next week when we will look at the Gulf countries and their attempts to build stability on a traditional notion of authority.